Hi fans of Rodgers and Hammerstein Cinderella, it's Ted Chapin, Chief Creative Officer at the Rodgers and Hammerstein Organization. In 1957, on the 31st of March, so obviously if they had any control over that date, and I'm not sure they did, they certainly liked the fact that it was an anniversary of the opening of Oklahoma, and it was the day that Cinderella, original television version of Cinderella, aired live across the country, starring the young star of My Fair Lady, Julie Andrews, not really known much outside New York. So the introduction of Julie Andrews to America on this live television production of Cinderella. CBS had decided they wanted to do NBC one better because NBC had shown Peter Pan with Mary Martin twice and gotten very large ratings. So CBS, you know, competition is good sometimes. CBS said, we're going to do one of these. We're going to go to the kings of Broadway and have them do a Cinderella for us. And I think it's astonishing to realize it was announced in September of 1956 and went on the air in March of 1957. So they wrote it, they cast it, they staged it, they lit it, they costumed it, they set it in that period of time. And it went out live March 31st across the country, and my favorite statistic about it is it averaged 4.46 viewers per television set in America, 107 million viewers. It was so important to CBS that the Rodgers and Hammerstein Cinderella be a success, that the two sponsors, Schulten and Pepsi-Cola, had contests among dealers months ahead of time to make all the people who would buy Old Spice and Pepsi-Cola know that Cinderella was going to air. So I think it was more successful than anybody actually anticipated. Because as John Cipher says in Todd Purdum's wonderful book, you know, he walked out of the studio, which all you New Yorkers, the building is still standing, at least the front of it is still standing on 81st and Broadway. It has a Starbucks and a Staples. But he walked out on Broadway and there was nobody there, and he wondered what had happened. And the fact of the matter is everybody was inside watching Cinderella. What Rodgers and Hammerstein were able to do consistently is write stories about characters that are not only interesting, and the stories are well told, but they managed to tap into something that those of us who love musical theater just can't lose. And even though Cinderella was a television commission, so they wrote it for a small, in those days, that's about the size of a television screen. They wrote it for that, but they didn't get rid of their ability to write songs for theatrical characters. And I think that's part of the reason why, to go to the end of the sequence, putting it in the Broadway production in 2013 with a modern sensibility to it, and a few other songs added, I will say, really stood up, because putting songs that Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote for television on a Broadway stage filled the theater. The other thing about Cinderella that is fascinating is that it has been remade twice so far. Maybe there'll be another one. In the 1960s, Leslie Ann Warren did it. Of course, Julie Andrews was the original. Leslie Ann Warren remade it in the 1960s. In early videotape, that one is very funny, I think, to look at, because they couldn't figure out depth in video. So when I showed it to my kids, I remember them saying, "Daddy, why is the horse in the living room?" Well, the horse isn't in the living room, the horse is outside, but the way they just couldn't figure out how to do depth in video. And then in 1997, it was made in an interracial cast with Brandy, Whitney Houston, and Whoopi Goldberg, and Victor Garber, and Paolo Montalban as the prince. And it is extraordinary the number of people of your generation and another generation that grew up with that one, and it meant so much to them. I mean, the woman who, the young African-American woman who was in Natasha Pierre said that seeing that on television is what made her realize there might be a place for her in the musical theater. It's an interesting question about whether Rodgers and Hammerstein, if they were alive today, would they be surprised by the success of their shows? I think they would be. And I think the reason that they would be, and it's something which I experienced early in my time at Rodgers and Hammerstein, when Dorothy Rodgers and Dorothy Hammerstein, both of whom had seen their husbands' earlier work, Rodgers and Hart, Hammerstein and Kern, kind of go out of fashion when Rodgers and Hammerstein became a huge hit. And I have a feeling that both women and their families wondered if Rodgers and Hammerstein were similarly going to go out of fashion. Dorothy Rodgers would say to me, if Dick were only here to see how successful these things were, he'd be astonished. So I think they would be pleased by that. And the good ones are willing to be open to new generations of interpretive artists, taking their material, finding what's in it, and figuring out how to do it for the audience of whatever that day is. When Rodgers and Hammerstein started to work, tradition had the composer come first, so it was not Hammerstein and Rodgers, it was Rodgers and Hammerstein. And there was something about Rodgers and Hammerstein that sounded and felt like a brand, and they were very smart about branding their shows so that most often it says Rodgers and Hammerstein's The King and I, Rodgers and Hammerstein's Oklahoma. So in a way, they were sort of early visionaries about the value of having a brand. And frankly, the responsibility that we at the office today have is to make certain that that brand not only continues, but is kept at a very high level of reputation. I'm thrilled to show you this book, Something Wonderful by Todd Purdum. It's really the first major biography of Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein and their collaboration that has ever been written. It sounds weird that that's actually the case. In their period, when they were writing, there were some books written about them, and both Oscar Hammerstein and Richard Rodgers have been the subject of biographies on their own. But Todd Purdum, who is a senior editor at Vanity Fair, very good writer, and turns out to be an enormous Rodgers and Hammerstein fan, has written this book, which comes out soon, and I would urge anybody interested in musical theater to read it, because their collaboration was, among other things, incredibly fertile. They basically wrote a new musical for Broadway every other year from 1943 to 1959, stopped only by the death of Oscar Hammerstein. And so that covers a lot of time. It happened to be, right in the middle of the 20th century of America. A lot of what they wrote about, although I believe they were writing stories that attracted them, I don't think they had a sort of political point of view. But looking at their material now, you realize how many times they had their finger on a pulse of something that was about to happen in the country, maybe just did. And I think that's part of why their shows continue to this day to be as popular as they are. Okay, this book could be called My Favorite Things. It could be called The Sound of Music. I mean, there are certain titles in Rodgers and Hammerstein that are kind of logical for a book like this. Something Wonderful is not, obviously it's a song from The King and I. It's not the most obvious title, but I think when Todd Purdum was writing this book, the more he got into how these two men worked, what attracted them to each other and to the various shows that they wrote, I think this is probably a true sentiment that the author felt as he was writing this book. And I have to say, I've, as I said, been around the Rodgers and Hammerstein office for a very long time. There are things in here I've never known. He has done amazing research. He found collections in libraries across this country, some of which I kind of knew about, some of which I did not know about. So as I'm reading some of these things and I'm thinking, yes, I know that, yes, I know that, oh, I never knew that. The commitment that these two men had to their craft, to their art, to just doing it consistently and as well as they possibly could. And for now we can look back and say their most popular show and their second most popular show are the first show they wrote, Oklahoma, and The Sound of Music, the last show they wrote. So they those are not bad bookends. And in between, you have South Pacific, you have Carousel, you have The King and I, you have Cinderella, you have then some that aren't quite as popular as those, but still, that's an astonishing collection of musicals. Not having any interest in being an actor, I thought, is it what role would I play or what person would I want to be? And the one that occurred to me, which is a strange one, but the character of Charlie in Allegro, which only 6 of you who are watching this are going to know what I'm talking about. It's the role that Norbert Leo Butz played on the album that we made on Allegro. He's kind of the best friend who kind of steers the leading guy into into the right way of thinking. So I thought that's about as close as I would get, because again, I'm not an actor, and I wouldn't want any of those juicy roles to dive into. But Charlie, I think I could handle. I think the characters in Cinderella, unique among the Rodgers and Hammerstein shows, that there are characters that we feel we know because it's the Cinderella story after all. It's a pretty straightforward, Prince and Cinderella, et cetera, et cetera. But what Rodgers and Hammerstein were able to do is to find the sort of, this sounds like a cliche, but I'll say it anyway, the emotional truths that are in these people with really good melodies and really good lyrics. So I think, in my own little corner, how many young girls who think of themselves as Cinderella don't have moments where they want to be in their corner to get it all together before they decide to move out in the world? How many men who fall in love with girls think 10 minutes ago I saw you and I went for you? So they were, again, Rodgers and Hammerstein, they were so able to find these things that turned out to be universal moments while they're dealing with the specifics.